Well, let's try this one more time. This is my second attempt to try to post this video, and the first time didn't have any audio. I figured out what the problem is. It should not occur again this time. Thank you for tuning back in. This is an important lesson. I appreciate you giving me a second chance if you're giving me a second chance. We were talking at Lakewoods Drive this morning about the problem with having too much money, essentially. That there is a struggle when we load up in the things of this life. There is a tendency, a strong tendency, in fact, to drift away from God's plan. We saw that with the people of Amos's day. We see that with the Laodiceans. The rich farmer is an example of this as well. We tend oftentimes not to do very well with prosperity. Well, how do we do with adversity? How do we do with poverty? Well, not necessarily a whole lot better. And there's a reason for that. The reason, of course, is it's not nearly so much about how much you have or do not have of the world's goods. It's about your attitude toward them. Is your life centered around the things of this life? Are you more focused on earthly issues, earthly problems, earthly challenges, successes, etc., than spiritual ones? If that is the case, then it's going to find you whether you're rich or poor. It may manifest itself a little bit differently, or maybe you're a little bit stronger in good times or stronger in weak times, etc. But there are opportunities for you to fail in any case. And what we need to do is make sure that we build up our faith, we build up our resilience, we build up our hope of heavenly things to the point where we're not going to be burdened down with trials and temptations and such. They're going to drag us down to earth and keep us from being the kind of people that God wants us to be. So let's try this again with the sound turned on this time and talk a little bit about the poverty problem, what it means for us when we don't have enough money and the struggle that places on us. And I might, without just belaboring the point again, emphasize that our idea of not having enough money is quite different, historically speaking, from the problems that other people have had of not having enough money. We in America are doing quite well by and large. Even our poor are pretty rich by the world standards. But if you see yourself right now as having a money problem, and by money problem here we mean not enough money, if that's where you are, if that's where your mind is these days, let's think about the problems that might come up with that. And let me begin by saying here, I don't necessarily fault you for thinking that you don't have enough money. We all go down that line from time to time. All of us feel like we would do better off with a little bit more. And in many ways, of course, we would. But the question is not so much, would we have a use for some extra money? The question is, how much do we really need it? Do we really see ourselves as being impoverished? If we do, if we view ourselves as being materially worse off because we do not have enough material possessions, that may indicate some problems in our minds, in our thoughts, in our spiritual life. And that's what we want to talk about here for a little bit today. First of all, and most obviously perhaps, is the idea of a carnal mind. And the carnal mind, pardon me, is a mind centered on the flesh. Carnal things versus spiritual things. Sometimes we overgeneralize and say carnal is bad and spiritual is good. That's missing the point. Spiritual things can be bad. Devil worship is spiritual. It's not a good thing necessarily. In fact, it's not a good thing. Money is carnal. Money is physical. The things of this flesh, of the physical life that we share here, are not necessarily bad things. Some of them are. Some of them can be turned toward good things or bad things, and that's the way money is. Money is the most earthly thing that we have here on this earth. If we focus entirely on our money, if we define our well-being in monetary terms, that's an indication that we have a carnal mind. Pardon me. And the carnal mind is set against the things of God in terms of our priorities, our value system. Paul calls us citizens of heaven. Our citizenship is in heaven, he says in Philippians 3 and verse 20. What that means is that is where we belong. That is our home, our real home. Earth, the physical world, is simply our location. It's where we happen to be in the moment. This is temporary. We will leave this world one of these days. And then what? Well, that's going to depend on the status of our spirit versus the status of our flesh, or even more specifically, our bank account. If we can get past the idea of valuing ourselves based on how much money we have, or valuing our neighbors based on how much they have or how we compare to them, or vice versa, then we can start breaking away from this idea of defining ourselves in such a shallow sort of way. We owe the Lord better than that. The carnal mentality, the fleshly mentality, is going to seriously inhibit our ability to process spiritual things. Paul talks about this at the beginning of 1 Corinthians chapter 3, how he was speaking to them as carnal ones and not as spiritual ones. If you want to explain the gospel to a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old, you're going to have limited ability to help them process high-level kind of spiritual concepts. That's not their fault. It's not your fault. It's just kind of the way it is. They have not yet been taught how to deal with the world from a spiritual mentality. It takes effort. It takes time. It takes maturity to look at the world in that sort of way. Well, if you are 14 or 40, it's a different story, isn't it? We need to be able to graduate past such things. And certainly, if we consider ourselves to be Christians, if we consider ourselves to be spiritual beings, if we consider ourselves to be heaven citizens, the idea of measuring our life in carnal terms is extraordinarily silly. I don't want to minimize it by using the word silly, but it shows a real lack of appreciation for spiritual things. We are higher, we are more noble than that, or certainly we should be. And so therefore it's beneath our dignity as Christians to get caught up in these material issues. Now, that's relatively easy for us to say when we are not having material issues. I'll freely admit that. My personal standing is pretty good these days, and maybe yours is as well. You're doing well enough to have internet and watch this kind of show on a YouTube channel or whatever, and so clearly you're not hurting as much as a lot of other people are. But regardless of how much you do or do not have, let's get away from the idea of our life as defined in terms of money. Closely related to that, I wanted to make a point about selfishness or self-centeredness, might be a better way of phrasing it here. If you define your world based on how much money you have, even partially, that is an indication that the defining parameters of your paradigm are self-centered. I don't have as much money as I ought to have, and therefore I'm unhappy. Well, how about your neighbor? How's your neighbor doing? How's the guy across the street? How's your brother in Christ? How's the stranger? How are people in general doing? Well, I'm not too concerned about that. I'm only concerned about me. Well, that's the problem right there, isn't it? The idea of defining the world on my bank account presupposes that my bank account's more important than yours or somebody else's. And where did we get that idea? We are told over and over again in the gospel that our relationship with Jesus is about elevating others, elevating him first of all, of course, and then looking to the issues of others. Paul talks about that in Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, going on to say how we're supposed to have this mind in ourselves that's also in Christ Jesus, that we're able to not just only think of our own interests, but also the interests of others. That's what Jesus did for us, as he goes on to say in Philippians chapter 2, the idea of Jesus condescending to an earthly existence and living his life here and dying an ignominious death and ultimately receiving the glory, of course, that the Father had in mind for him. This is the example that he has set for us, that we should be willing also to debase ourselves, to accept less, so as to prioritize the needs of other people. If we cannot find it in our hearts to celebrate the well-being of others when we ourselves are struggling, that's selfishness. That's a self-centered approach toward the world. We need to be better than that. Jesus calls us to be better than that. How would we be if Jesus had that kind of attitude? If Jesus only died for the people who deserved it? Jesus only was willing to suffer to the point where he thought it was appropriate, or where it looked like the general population was suffering, or whatever. That's a nonsensical way of looking at the life of Christ. And yet we call ourselves Christians. We are following after his example. We're following after his spirit, his pattern of behavior. Well, let's follow his pattern of behavior then. Jesus is the one that told us, as Paul quotes him in Acts chapter 20, it's better to give than to receive. Well, if we really believe that other people's interests are as important, if not more important, than our own, then our own personal financial situation should not be nearly as big of a deal in assessing our standing on earth as we like to make it out to be sometimes. Even if you accept that financial things are an important thing, and they are to a certain degree. It's not just our financial things, it's also the things of others. So let's open up our mind to the possibility that maybe we're being a little self-centered, maybe we're being a little self-involved, and that we need to look to other people. Now, I'll give you a bit of warning here with regard to this. If you will postpone your pity party, if you'll postpone your feeling bad for yourself, for your depression, if you will, until you get a feel for other people's depression. If you say, you know what, I'm going to think about others first, you're going to find far more often than not that there is somebody else out there, somebody who's near and dear to you, somebody who's close to you in proximity, emotionally or physically, who is worse off than you are. And you will be put in a position where you cannot, in good conscience, complain about your financial situation because this other person's financial situation is worse. So if you are scheduling your pity party for after you put other people first, I've got a wake-up call for you. It's not going to work out that way very well. Realistically speaking, the overwhelming majority of us are doing quite well in this world. We might like to do better, and we might think that in times past we did do better, or maybe we're concerned about how we're going to be doing in the future or what have you. Ultimately, that's not the concern. That's not the main consideration. What we need to be focused on is not just focusing on ourselves. We need to be looking at the things of other people as well. And we touched on this already a little bit, but let's talk about a larger perspective for a moment. If we think in 21st century United States of America that our financial problems are worth comparing to the financial problems of other people today or other people in other times, we're kidding ourselves. I don't know how much of a historian you are. I'm not the most well-read person that there is, but I know enough reading the things that I have read. I know enough from reading the Bible that historically speaking, poor is the norm. Poor is standard. Generally speaking, there is a very, very small population of very, very rich people, at least rich by the standards of the day. And then 95% or more of the people out there who have virtually nothing at all. That is the way that people tend to live overwhelmingly over the last, how many thousands of years that you want to track a human race. And this is true with regard to democratic nations, totalitarian nations, in between nations. People tend to really, really struggle in the flesh. And you see this example, many examples in the Bible of people who didn't have much, who lived hand to mouth. Jesus exhorts us to pray for daily bread. What do we think daily bread is? Most of the people listening to Jesus were very contented to have enough to eat on that given day. They didn't have 401ks. They didn't have retirement accounts. They didn't have retirement as far as that goes. There's living and there's dying. And if you got enough food to eat on that day, then you were living, and that's a good thing. And I'm not trying to dismiss the problems of poor people today or poor people in times past, but to think that we might be complaining that we're having trouble making our car payment, for instance, or having trouble paying our mortgage, or having trouble affording organic food at the grocery store, whatever our problems may be. And I'm, again, not dismissing our problems. If that's what we're complaining about, we have no idea what poverty is. When Paul says in 1 Timothy 6 and verse 8 that we should be content with food and clothing, what he's saying there is if you get the very basics of life, if you get the rudimentary things, if you have enough food to eat, if you have basic shelter from the elements, you should be able to find contentment there. I suspect, obviously I can't speak definitively here, but I suspect that very few, if any, people in your life that struggle with these basic things. We have governmental programs in place. We have charities in place. We have a relatively robust economy by historical standards anyway. It's unthinkable that an American would not have access to food, would not have access to shelter, clothing, etc. Well, we know for a fact that there are people on this earth today who are struggling with those very basic kind of things. And we know that others over the centuries have done so on a regular basis. So again, if what we call poverty in the modern day, in a civilized society like ours, quote unquote, civilized society of ours, if this kind of poverty is what we're complaining about, then maybe it's time for us to reassess. Now, if that sounds like I'm being dismissive of people and their problems, and I apologize for that. That's not the point at all. But there is an opportunity for you to rejoice in what you have. There is an opportunity for you to be content in what you have. Paul says it's a secret, but he says he's found the secret to being content. And he explains it to us. It's maybe so simple that you might miss it. There in Philippians 4, verse 13, he says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. If you have a relationship with Jesus, that should be enough to secure your mind and secure your heart as you're trying to make your way through this life, which is a challenge for all of us on one front or another, maybe all fronts at the same time if you're having a really bad day. But you can do this. You can bolster your strength. You can find hope. You can find peace in what you might call, what society today might call, an impoverished state. We're not begging for God to bring on the poverty, as it were. Maybe the words of Agur that we see in Proverbs chapter 30 are appropriate. They're giving neither poverty nor riches. That's his prayer. And maybe that's where we need to be. Maybe that's not where we want to be, especially. We'd rather have the riches and take our chances. But maybe it would be better for us to aim for the middle, for us to be grateful for what we have, certainly, but not get so abundant in our possessions that we forget about God and curse him. What this basically boils down to, and we'll close with this, is a lack of faith. Because if we believe that Jesus does take care of us, if we believe that if we seek first his kingdom, all these things will be added to us, then that should get us through these difficult times, no matter how difficult or how long those times may be. And of course, I trust that you realize, we'll point it out anyway, just in case, when Jesus says all these things, he's not saying this car and that car and this house and et cetera. That's not the point. He's talking about physical provision. He's talking about getting through this life. You will get what you need after a fashion, in some fashion. You'll get enough to be grateful. You'll get enough to thank the Lord. If you will put my things first, if you'll put Jesus' things first, if you put the kingdom first. That's what he's trying to say. So can we do that? And if we can't do that, if we are so incredibly distracted, if we're so completely obsessed with our physical problems, doesn't that not mean that we have a faith problem? You either believe Jesus or you don't. And if you believe that Jesus is going to give you all these things, if you put the kingdom first, and you're putting the kingdom first, and yet you're nervous or worried about all these things, there's a disconnect there somewhere. And it's probably with your faith. It's probably with how you're defining these terms here. Not the way that he's defining, the way that you would like to define them. So let's go back to base. Let's go back to the core of the Christian experience. Do you believe in Jesus? Do you accept him as your Lord and Savior? Yes, I do. Okay, great. Well, what are you going to do with that then? If he calls you to live every life in hope and in joy and in peace and in activity, spiritual activity in his name, if you are to be shining his light at all times, if you're to be doing all things without grumbling and disputing, Philippians chapter 2, verse 14, if that's what he's calling you to do, and you find yourself incapable of doing that, well, do you think the problem is going to be on his end, or do you think the problem is going to be on your own end? And let's not completely ignore this notion that someone might say, well, if I would just get a little bit higher level, higher standard of living, then it would be easier for me to have faith. It'd be easier for me to trust in God. Why won't he bless me like he blesses X or Y or whatever? Well, as we pointed out this morning, faithful in little, faithful in much. Jesus says in Luke chapter 16, I think it's verse 10, if we cannot find a way to be faithful to Jesus where we are, we don't have a right to tell him that we would be faithful somewhere else, and therefore it's his fault for not putting us in that place. It's always going to be our failure or our success of faith. It's who we are, not where we are, that determines whether we are going to be found as one of the faithful ones. Do we have enough confidence in Jesus to trust in him and to know that he is, in fact, watching over our lives, providing for us, taking care of us, and ultimately shepherding us all the way to heaven? We either have the faith or we don't have the faith. And if you do have the faith, if you do truly believe in your heart of hearts that Jesus is Lord, that you are a child of God, that heaven is your ultimate destination, then let's back away from all these complaints and difficulties and whining about what we have, or more to the point, what we don't have in this world. If the economy goes in the tank in 2023, we're not happy about that. Obviously, nobody's happy about that. But that is yet another opportunity for us to lean on the Lord. That's how Paul saw his thorn in the flesh in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. That's how we should see our thorns in the flesh. If we are struggling, if we are hurting, if we're in pain, if we're in doubt, that's just that much more opportunity for us to lean on the Lord and accept his will for our lives and trust in him that he will provide. As Jesus says there, my grace is sufficient for you. And his grace is sufficient for you, and it's sufficient for me. Knowing that we are in the hand of God, knowing that Jesus is Lord, and that heaven is our ultimate destination, that ought to be enough to help us deal with whatever kind of shortfall, whatever kind of challenge, financial or otherwise, that may face us here in this life. I hope that you continue to study and pray and work toward this goal, to find that contentment that is so elusive in this life, that so many of our neighbors who continue to seek it in fleshly terms and continue to fail to find it. Hopefully we can be stronger and wiser than that and look toward heaven for our sufficiency, heaven for our assurance, instead of looking to ourselves. Thank you very much for listening and for sticking with us, for checking back the second time around. I hope this has been a blessing to you, and I hope that God is blessing you amply and that you can find contentment and joy where he places you. Thank you, and God bless.